Welcome to another episode of Talking VoIP with Datagate. I'm Mark Loveys, and in this episode, we're discussing the key things that service providers need to know about tax and compliance when they decide to resell telecom services in America. Selling telecom can be profitable and for service providers, but compliance can be complex. Calculating telecom taxes and surcharges manually can be very inefficient and challenging. So we're joined today by Brent Reeves, who's a co-founder of CereTax, to explain how service providers can take the complexities out of becoming a VoIP reseller. Datagate has recently integrated the telecom billing solution with CereTax to automate telecom tax and surcharge calculations. Brent, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Brent, please tell us a bit about CereTax. CereTax has an interesting background. Who are the people behind CereTax, and how did CereTax get started?
Yeah, actually, I don't know that there's one person or a small group of people that are behind CereTax. We're actually kind of a group of folks that have come together from years of experience within this industry to form what we think is the most innovative tax calculation product in the market. So, founders wise, it's myself and my partner Mike Sanders. We really go back, I guess, really to the late '90s. When my partner Mike Sanders formed his first company, which was in the telecom compliance space, a company called Tax Partners, which at the time was the largest tax outsource compliance provider. It was then sold to Thomson Reuters, which is then sold to KPMG and is actually still KPMG's internal tax compliance engine. And then in about, I think it was 2010, him and I formed a company called SureTax, which was then acquired. I think we were acquired in 2015, 2016 by Wolters Kluwer. Then we just decided after a few years of sitting on the sidelines, we just decided we wanted to re-enter the space. Technology had changed quite a bit. So we got together a group of people that, like I said, have long legacy in the telecom compliance and tax arena to see what we could do. So, from that came CereTax.
Wow, that's very interesting. And so how do you differentiate CereTax from other telecom tax engines on the market?
Yeah. So, having done it for, 20 years now, when we kind of got together and formed CereTax, the first thing we did was say, okay, well, what were the top 10 problems that we used to have? What were the top 10 ticket items that we would get from support and everything else? And how do we engineer out of that? So the first thing we did is we went away from being a hosted solution and really become a true native cloud solution. So the entire solution is built natively in the cloud. And what that does is it allows for us to be able to to give each one of our clients extremely high performance throughput, whether it be, transactions per second, eliminate, maintenance windows, eliminate downtime. The fact that we are a multi-regional solution, again, native to AWS, we're able to support, again, very high throughputs, and as I mentioned, it also offer 5 nines uptime without any maintenance windows. So those are just a few of the things we did. One of the other things we did was build the entire thing on a rules engine, which makes the solution extremely flexible. So a lot of the things that we used to be able to have to do either in a dedicated instance or in a high performance environment or private cloud, we don't have to do that anymore. There's no shared infrastructures, no shared architecture. We've eliminated, 80% of the code changes that would need to be made in order to make really kind of custom configurations by doing that in a rules engine. So we really took kind of like I said, all the things that used to plague us before. We just said, well, using new technology, how do we engineer those out? So those are kind of some of the key factors.
Yeah, no, that's great, and we have quite a lot in common with the Datagate billing engine as well. So that's very interesting. And so, going back to our service providers now, what's the first thing a service provider in the United States needs to do to start reselling telecom services with respect to compliance and all the various telecom regulations?
Yeah, so if it's a managed service provider that's never sold telecom products before, as a resale, so voice over IP or what have you, the first thing I say is get some counsel, get some advice, get some really solid advice, because most of the people we see that are entering into the space have a long legacy of selling their managed service, products. So whether it be hardware or professional services or whatever, And when you enter into the telecom market as a seller, and as the carrier of record, I should point out also, it can have impacts on that business as well. So before you just kind of leap into it, I would say the first thing they have to do is get, is get good solid advice, because there's a lot of strategies that you can put in place that preserve, the things that you're doing it for, which is improved margins, improved control over a customer, also improved value of the company. A lot of times, you're adding recurring revenue to a company that's typically, kind of a one-time fee type of company, which can really add multiples to the valuation of the company. But you want to make sure you do it in such a way that it doesn't impact your legacy business. So yeah, that'd be the first thing to do, is just say get good solid counsel.
That's absolutely very good. So, do all telecom resellers need to register with the FCC, with the various state and local authorities before they can start selling VoIP?
Yes. So before you start selling any type of voice or data or telecom services, again, if you're going to be the one invoicing for those services, so you are the one that's the provider of record, then yes, you absolutely need to register. Now, you don't need to go out and register in every state and every county and every jurisdiction right off the bat. Again, that's where counsel comes in play, is to tell you, okay, well, based on the area in which you're selling, based on your current Nexus profile, based on where you think your territories are, they can advise you on where you should register. But absolutely, with the FCC, you really don't want to get behind in that area, because if you ever do get audited by the FCC, and you haven't, one of the first questions they ask is, when did you start providing these services? So you really don't want to be caught in a situation where, I was really providing those services 6 months ago and I didn't register, or what have you. So yes, you absolutely need to register and get approval to sell the services.
Right. And what does it mean, the term de minimis? Where a reseller may be at a certain level, and if someone's de minimis, do they need to be charging taxes and collecting taxes? What are the implications there?
Yeah, so de minimis just means that if you are charging for FCC, for Universal Service Fund charges, or any of the federal regulatory fees, if the amount of your sales is such that you would owe less than $10,000 if you are filing direct, as a direct, what they call a direct contributor to USF, then you are de minimis if you're below that threshold. If you're below that threshold, then really you work with your carrier, your provider, right? So whether you're buying or reselling services from AT&T or Bandwidth or one of these, and you work with them in order to make sure that those obligations are being met at the universal, at the FCC level. You don't have to file those direct. You still have to be registered, though. That's a common misconception, that even if you're de minimis, you do have to be registered with the FCC. So they do have to know that you're there. They do not have to know that you're providing services. It's just that you work with your carrier to make sure that those remittances are appropriate.
Interesting. Yeah. And so how does it work for MSPs on a local versus state versus federal level? I mean, we talked there about the FCC, but what about at the state and local level, if they're only selling a small quantity of services?
If it's a small quantity of services, there still may be some regulatory agencies that you need to register and file with. You obviously need to be collecting 911s, and that's a big area also, because 911 areas often don't mirror the tax areas. Meaning, like, if you're paying a local sales tax, you typically will say, well, I'm paying this city tax, but the 911 boundary may be different than the actual sales tax boundary. So that's where it comes into play, to make sure you have an engine, kind of like what we're doing together as a team, to make sure that you're collecting and remitting these types of charges to the appropriate authority. So, depending on what your state you're in, there may not be any registrations that are needed to be a telecom provider. But some states do have both, state and local regulatory agencies. Some states have like UUTs, which is like a utility users taxes and things of that nature, that you need to make sure that that you're clear on whether or not you're obligated to pay those, and that's dependent upon sometimes what type of service you're selling, and again, obviously where. So Federal level is a given from a registration standpoint. The state and local levels are dependent upon where you are.
I see. I see. And how often do these tax rates and the rules behind them change? Is it realistic for a service provider to manually keep track of these changes themselves? And
yeah, that's a great question. So, I would say they change no less than quarterly. And whether that's, again, USF or when you think about all the jurisdictional levels up and down, right? So federal, state, and local, between all of those, something is going to change constantly. So is it realistic for them to keep up with it? Yeah, sure. If you're in a small area, right? So depending on where you are, again, whether you need a solution like ours to do the taxing, the calculations part of it, it's going to be dependent upon the breadth of which you provide services, the types of services you use, and again, the number of jurisdictions you're potentially obligated to pay. So yeah, if you're in a small jurisdictional area, yeah, it's potentially capable for you. But once you start getting out of even 2-3 states, then really no. I mean, it becomes much no burden. And then again, even if you're only in one state, depending on the number of locales that are in that state and which state it is, it still may not be very realistic for you to keep track of. So again, it's kind of I hate to always give like what if answers or it depends answers, but quite frankly, with telecom services, a lot of times it isn't. It depends. But again, it's where starting on the right foot with some advice really helps.
Yes, I see. And so how often are filings required for service providers? I mean, and what factors affect that? What's the regular frequency there?
Quite frankly, it's all the time, right? So there are some filings that are monthly, there's some filings that are quarterly, some filings that are annually. Again, it depends on the size and the locale on where you are.
Right, I see. And so and what's involved if a smaller MSP wants to do their own filing? What's typically involved in that? Is that something they can do online, or how does that work?
MSP is doing their own filing. Absolutely, it's possible. Now, I personally would recommend, at least at the federal level, that you always have a third party do it. I would not take on the burden of filing with the FCC direct. Now, again, de minimis notwithstanding, right? Which conversation that you have with your carrier when you're getting started on how to facilitate that process. But again, that right advice that you get at the beginning is critical. From a state and local level, yeah, I mean, if you're in a smaller footprint, then yeah, sure, state and local level is definitely something that can be done. But once you start expanding, and again, depending on what state you're in, even just getting outside of a few jurisdictions, it gets really, really complex. But regardless of what state you're in, if you do start to expand within outside of 2-3 states, yeah, it's gonna be really hard for you to do. And quite frankly, the cost of having a professional do it is not that burdensome that I wouldn't highly recommend it once you hit that kind of threshold.
Right, I see. So one of the reports that we offer, CereTax and Datagate, is the traffic study.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about what the traffic study is and when it should be performed?
Yeah. So a traffic study is basically a study of traffic, as it implies, as the word implies. But what that means is, okay, how much of the communication services inter versus intrastate traffic. Right. So, where's the origination and the termination of the various services? Reason that's important is because that's how you kind of determine what your FUSF liabilities are. Right. So if you haven't done a traffic study, which means you don't really have any data to back up what's an origination and termination point of all of these communication services, then you're going to use what's called the safe harbor, which just means that, okay, the FCC has basically put out and said, okay, here is, if you don't have a traffic study, then here's the general rule of thumb. And if you apply tax and fees, and universal service fund charges along these lines, meaning you're treating your percentage of your bill that is subject to USF, you're treating your bill along the safe harbor route, then you're going to be in compliance. That's great. Now, the only problem with that is, as you get larger, you may see that, okay, well, really 64.9% of my traffic isn't interstate traffic. It's really only 15% of my traffic is interstate, which means then only 15% of your bill is actually subject to the universal service fund, whereas the other 85% of that charge is not. Right. So As you start to expand, when you get started, the safe harbor route is the easiest and safest route. But as you start to expand, it may behoove you to actually do a traffic study and see, okay, can I take a much more advantageous position and lower the fees for my customers?
Right.
And I just want to also say, I'll say things like taxes and fees. And, again, I'm not a telecom lawyer. So a telecom lawyer listening to this may, go, well, so a lot of times those fees are those terms used interchangeably. They're not. Okay. So a tax is a tax, a fee is a fee, a surcharge is a surcharge. And there are very specific rules on how you represent each one of these things. For instance, you can't put things that are a fee or a surcharge or an optional pass through on your bill as a tax. That's misrepresentation. And again, another thing that we're facilitating through this partnership is making sure those invoices are represented appropriately. But a lot of times you will hear you'll hear things like USF tax. Well, it's technically not a tax, and if you represent it as such, it's misleading and it could get you in trouble. So that's just kind of a sidebar.
Right. Interesting. So we sometimes come across resellers who've been selling VoIP and they didn't realize the compliance issues that they were subject to. What would be your advice to a reseller who's been selling VoIP? They have not been charging taxes. They might be in some kind of trouble now that they, obviously want to get out of trouble. And what can be done for them? What would be your advice generally?
Yeah, so my advice would be the same advice I give you when you ask the question about getting started, is you treat it like you're starting over, right? And what I mean by that is first thing you do is get advice, right? You get counsel. Don't just go oops and start day one and start charging taxes. You don't want to pretend like nothing happened before and okay, we're just going to start now. So the first thing I would do is say, okay, recognize it's an issue. It's usually an issue that though with the right team, you can get through it, you can get past it. But you are going to potentially be subject to to some fines. For past liability. Again, depends on how long you let it go. What was the position you took? Were you actually collecting and not remitting? That is a big issue, as opposed to just not collecting at all. Right. So, you want to correct it as soon as possible. You don't want to let it, linger. Because what is a small problem, if you've only been, providing, services for a short period of time or even a couple of years, but your numbers aren't that big. What is a small problem can quickly become a big problem. So it's just swallow the toad and get the counsel to and get it kind of nipped in the bud. But the biggest thing is just don't pretend with yourself that it's going to go away all by itself. We've actually seen it's a good point, because a lot of times people come into to a program like this, right, and then they say, okay, well, we expect to sell X. Well, because they have great teams like yours and ATT or Bandwidth or one of these other carrier providers that have programs that help them grow their business quicker, they grow exponentially more than they thought. And then all of a sudden, maybe they're a target for acquisition. And we have seen that happen actually more than once, where a company that was a target of acquisition suddenly realizes, during due diligence, they have unfunded liabilities because they have not been reporting correctly. And we have seen it either derail a transaction entirely, or it creates a huge set aside, right, for in a transaction. So as soon as you realize that you're out of compliance, deal with it. Is the biggest thing I would say.
Right. Excellent. So now that CereTax and Datagate are integrated as software products, what does this now offer telecom service providers?
Yeah, so biggest thing was what it offers is it makes it easy to know what you should be charging and what you should be collecting, right? So through that automation platform, we're able to apply the appropriate taxes and fees, again, based on your profile, right? So your profile is going to dictate how we implement the solution. Are you de minimis? Are you in multiple states? Where's your nexus? Things of that nature. But through it, it's a very easy way to, number one, accurately calculate it, but number two, do it quickly, right? So to get up and running now as a service provider that's now deciding to sell, voice services, or any kind of communication service, whether it be IoT or whatever, it's a quick way to say, okay, my invoice is populated properly. And behind that, also, now I have all the reporting to know, okay, here's everybody I was supposed to pay. Here's all my liabilities. and then facilitate that whole process. So through this partnership, number one, like I said, it makes it really quick, but also it makes it very accurate. But more so than anything, it gives them the proper data to file all those appropriate returns. It also gives them the data to defend themselves if they ever do get audited. So we have been in situations in the past where a very large MSP, multiple state, 50 state MSP, $1 billion company, they start to sell communication services, where before it was all just hardware, professional services, and things of that nature. And then the big challenge is, okay, well, what does that mean for us, and how do we stay compliant? How do we know everybody we're supposed to owe? And and we're able to quickly spin that up and say, okay, well, here's detailed reporting. But the biggest thing is companies like that are targets for audits, right? Because suddenly there's a new line of business, they're a big name. Even if you're not, though, I mean, odds are, you may get audited over time. So one of the things you want to make sure you have is you have good records of all the data. And through this integration, anything that touches your system, that touches my system for taxation, there's a very detailed audit trail that says, okay, here's everything that was taxed, but not just here's what the taxes were, but here's why, which is a huge, huge factor when you go get audited. So yeah, so again, ease of implementation, very quick to spin up, can add product to services at any point in time. You could change, we've seen companies set up separate entities for their communication services, right? So it's real easy to say, okay, well, we're going to bifurcate the data for this company here, but all this data needs to flow through this legal entity. So it's easy to do that. And then again, having that audit trail.
And Brent, we're both going to be at the same show at the MSP Summit later on this month, I understand.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's October 30th down in Miami. So very much looking forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at the Fontainebleau, isn't it? That's a great place, I understand.
It is. So South Beach is always fun. So again, looking forward to that, and having a little bit of fun, but also making myself available if you have people that need to to ask questions, or that are considering entering the market and just want to see what are the pitfalls, or what have you. Make myself available for your team.
Oh, that's amazing. So, that's a great opportunity for any MSPs wanting to get into selling telecom services to have. We'll have some very deep tax expertise, as you just heard, and we're at booth number 315 at the MSP Summit. Well, Brent, thank you very much for being our guest today on the show. It's been extremely interesting, and really appreciate all the insights you've given us. And to our audience, thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions, or you'd like any further information about CereTax or Datagate and CereTax integration, the contact details are on the screen right now. So thank you, everyone. And as always, may the VoIP be with you.